Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. In this video, we're going to bounce around North Carolina State University's campus and see some interesting plants. Some of them will be some older things, and some of them may be some new plantings around campus. Our garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina is just 5 or 6 blocks from campus, and we're able to walk around quite a bit. Real funny story before I start. My son, Charlie, who's been on the channel before, we were doing tours of college campuses a few years ago, and we were over at UNC in Chapel Hill, touring Chapel Hill's campus, and it's got this beautiful old architecture. It's one of the oldest public schools in America, if you don't know that, and all the kids are enamored by the big buildings and everything. And all Charlie can see is the plants, because once you tune in on the plants, and he had spent his whole life tuned into the plants, we're just looking at the gardens, everybody else is looking at the architecture, and he turns around and goes, "I hate you right now." Because he just can't see it. Once you see them, and you know what they are, and you can start to identify them, they become the main kind of focus of what you see. So we're going to start with this beautiful Hollywood juniper. This is one of my absolute favorite junipers. I think I'm going to do a video called "Junipers Get No Love." Okay, and it's coming soon. This is one of our absolute favorites. Steph and my favorites. This is an older Hollywood juniper. This is what they do. If you planted 100 Hollywood junipers, you'd have 100 different plants with 100 different growth habits. If you just allow them to grow like this, they can get this old gnarled bark twisting and turning. It looks like, if you go to an ocean setting and you see what the wind kind of does to plants over time, it's just kind of how Hollywood junipers grow. It looks like the wind and weather has forced it in a lot of different directions. It's covered in juniper berries right now, and it's just an incredible piece of architecture. And on a college campus like this, they can just let it. They've got the space, and time to let something grow like this and become what it's supposed to look like. So this is Hollywood juniper. Let's jump around. This is one of our absolute favorite trees right here. This is a Kentucky Yellowwood, or Cladastris. One of our great natives. It's in the Fabaceae, or the pea family, so it's good at making seed, but really beautiful. It has a vase-shaped habit. Incredible yellow fall color. I mean, just an absolute standout in the fall garden, and again, a very underused native tree. This one's planted next to a large building, but probably not really in enough space for it to be, to do what it could become over time. These can get quite big. This is definitely one of the taller growing shade trees, but again, it's underused. And when I'm doing consultation work and people are trying to pick trees, we're always trying to pick, what red maple do I want? When we have some other really great native shade trees out there that have some interest. This one has interesting flowers, interesting foliage, interesting bark as it ages, really smooth bark. One of the things on campus over here is they have tagged some of the trees for us, so that we're shooting this video in January, so kind of hard to identify trees this time of year. So it's nice to have a sign on something like this. Underused tree. We ran into this beautiful Deodor Cedar specimen. There's plenty of room for this one to get large over the years. This is a plant that gets big. There's a couple of them in the neighborhood that are just, it would take 3 people to reach around the bottom of them. That's how big one of these Deodor Cedars can actually become. College campus is the perfect place for it if you have an 1 or 2 acre lot, to put a Deodor Cedar. But we do have other named varieties, cultivars, like we have Feeling Blue at the house, which is a weeping Deodor Cedar. There's some options to put some interesting Deodor Cedars in your landscape that won't become this big. But if you have space for it, wow, what a tree. All the new growth on it is blue. We're here in January, and a lot of the conifers are still actively growing, because it's like 27 this morning, 27 degrees Fahrenheit, but that's about as cold as it's been. And so a lot of the conifers are still showing, good color right now. Beautiful tree. Sometimes you'll see them lose their leader, in the top over some period of time. when they reach, seems like when they reach a certain height, there's some poor, they end up losing their leader. and then just become really funky. There's one in the neighborhood that's probably, not an exaggeration, 50 feet wide. It reaches across the entire property. So be careful with this one on a small lot, but definitely worth coming to see on a college campus or buying one that fits your ornamental landscape. Here's one of our great native trees to the southeast United States, and kind of a band along Interstate 95 up to maybe Maryland, and then down eastern North Carolina and around to the Gulf area. This is a sweet Bay Magnolia. These get these incredible fragrant flowers in the late spring, early summer. Has this kind of grayish foliage, especially on the bottom side of the leaf. So once the tree gets some size on it and you're looking up into it, it has this kind of grayish blue color to it. Really interesting bark. This one's been here a long time, and it's in kind of a narrow space next to this building. So it hasn't probably had the room that it would require to really, you know, be probably a slightly nicer specimen if it had a little more space. And there's some other large trees shading it over here. Again, one of our great natives. This is in flower. You can smell it from hundreds of yards away. This tree is incredibly interesting, probably a little controversial as well. This is Morus alba, which is the Chinese mulberry, the silkworm mulberry. These leaves are fed to silkworms. And then the leaves can also be made into tea in other places in Southeast Asia. A lot of uses for this plant. Of course, it gets edible fruit as well. This one is unfortunately naturalized. It's definitely an invasive, and our native mulberries have crossed with this, and we see them all over the place. You really can't separate the two out in the wild anymore. But this one has this incredible contorted habit. It's been here for a long time. Been a lot of efforts to save it. It's crazy contorted habit with wires and bolts and sticks and limbs and all kinds of things in an effort to save it. It's really, really a beautiful tree. No real point in thinking about tearing it out because it's naturalized into a good portion of the United States already. Any thoughts of it not, of taking it out and it being less invasive would be, pointless at this point. Incredible piece of artwork basically here on campus. They're doing some construction over here, so the space doesn't look all that great right this minute, but just a beautiful specimen. Found this beautiful group of soft caress Mahonia, and they're out here in a lot of sunlight, which is, kind of interesting, but there's some Liriope spicata running through this bed, and I think it's shading the roots. And I've talked about a lot of times plants are more capable of taking sun than you think, and a lot of times it's the roots that are getting damaged. So these are really baking for some period of time during the day. There's a few with flowers on them over here, and as you get toward the end of as we start to come out of winter a bit, they'll have a few more flowers on them, and I can see where they did a little bit of flowering earlier, like earlier in December, which is way early for them. I think we got a little bit of cold and then got on this roller coaster, and things are blooming a bit early. But this is a beautiful group of soft caress Mahonia. You'll see you're getting these little wild stems up on them like this. Any of those can be chased down in the plant and cut off down lower if you want to keep them more compact than this, or I think they kind of look interesting like this. This is one of my favorite little spots on campus. There's this tunnel of Camellia japonicas, and we're here a little bit too early to have them blooming. I was hoping, because there are Camellia japonicas blooming all over our neighborhood, that these would be blooming. They're in these raised beds, and it's so dry. I can't believe there's no irrigation in these beds, and somehow camellias are just amazing to me once they're established, that they can take this kind of abuse. But there are flower buds all over these. We're maybe a month away from this just being a tunnel of pink flowers. And we've been over here before when they've been in full flower, and it's just amazing. But it's just a tunnel leading up to one of the buildings here through this entrance. And you can see how big Camellia japonicas, can get in time. These, again, this is another one that we think of as, shadier you know, part shade or shadier conditions, but they're really adaptable, you know, out here. Now they're shading their own roots, and so they're in good shape. But big giant Camellia japonicas. Well, this one's super interesting. We're in an area that's really well protected, and probably quite a bit warmer than anywhere else on the campus. And these Abilia are in bloom. I think these are Rose Creek Abilia that have just gotten big over time. I think if you buy Rose Creek Abilia, you can keep them 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide, something like that. But these have now stretched up to about 4 feet because they're in a little bit of shade too. This one, Rose Creek Abilia, is a great plant. It's obviously evergreen. These are hardy in zones 6 to 9. In zone 6, these Abilia can thin a bit more in a cold winter, in a real zone 6 winter. But if it, you know, in southern areas they stay this evergreen, you get the flowers on them, and then where the flower falls off, you're left with this kind of red, looks like a cluster of red flowers, but it's just the leftover parts of the flower afterwards. But we're filming this on a 27-degree morning in January. It's kind of hard to believe that they're in bloom. If you have these in your garden, they'll typically start blooming in June. They're one of the later flowering shrubs. They can be pruned hard in the wintertime. They'll flush out, look great during the spring, start blooming in the summer, and bloom right through fall until it gets cold. And well, it hasn't gotten cold enough yet, so here they are blooming in January. We've talked about Viburnum Tinus many times on the channel. This one can be a little more cold sensitive in our, even in probably zone 8A. In the right winter, Viburnum Tinus can get damaged. And even if the plant doesn't get damaged, frequently it blooms so early that the flowers can get damaged. This one has decided to bloom, you know, right at in the early January. This one has like red flower buds that almost look like flowers themselves before these actually open up. And then it has this great green lustrous foliage. The stems on it are kind of red on the new growth. Great plant. This is one of the biggest ones I've ever seen. Typically we'll keep these 3 or 4 feet in most landscapes, but it's also in a very industrial space on campus. So as stuff goes out, it'll come into, you know, its full splendor here of, you know, it's probably 9 or 10 feet tall. Again, one of the biggest Viburnum Tinus I've ever seen. But it's in, you know, completely surrounded by dumpsters in an industrial part of campus here where a lot of the work gets done on campus. But I just couldn't, I had to stop and film this beautiful Viburnum Tinus that hides behind dumpsters. One thing you'll see here is the remnant berries from last year. After the flowers, they'll get this really lustrous blue fruit on them that, you know, tend to be persistent most of the season. So that's another added thing for Viburnum Tinus. I think one thing that's interesting about coming to a college campus like this is there's all these alcoves and nooks, places out of the wind where plants can thrive. You know, some marginal plants can thrive. This is another one that's just really much bigger than you would normally see it out in the landscape. This is Raphaeolipsis umbellata, which is Indian hawthorn. But it's an interesting Indian hawthorn. Typically has a kind of an upright, narrow habit. I grew a lot of these. A lot of the Indian hawthorns we use in our landscapes are little low doming things, where this one tends to be a little more upright. It's beautiful white flowers on it, followed by a blue berry that's actually edible. I think in Asia they use it for various things. Deer love any Indian hawthorn. So this is not a deer resistant plant for sure. But here on the college campus where it's been allowed to grow, these are 8 or 9 feet tall. And again, biggest ones I've ever seen in the garden. There are a lot of laurels on campus. I believe this is autoleucon laurel, which typically people use as something that would be more like 2 to 3 feet tall. But again, out here where they're just allowed to grow, you know, they've gotten some size. The trunks on them are, you know, 6 inches around down at the bottom. They're blooming super early. This is an early spring blooming plant. They tend to get these white flower spikes on them. A little bit oversweet to me, but a lot of people like the fragrance on them. Beautiful dark green, shiny foliage. Really adaptable. I mean, if you look around campus, you'll see them in a little more sun than you'd think they'd take. You'd see them in really dark, shady spaces, kind of moist foundation plantings between these buildings. I'm sure they're staying pretty wet in between in between rains, and they're doing pretty well. I had a terrible time growing these plants. This is one of those plants that's easier in the ground than it is as a container plant. Tend to be a little pricey because most of them are grown out on the West Coast. They get, if you overhead irrigate them a lot, they get a disease called shot hole, where you have little holes in the leaves and then the customers don't want to buy them. And so if they're grown here on the East Coast, they're typically, you know, each plant has its own little irrigation tube so that they're not overhead irrigated. And the leaves don't stay wet for a long time. So, but most of them are grown out on the West Coast and then shipped. So you're going to pay a little more for these autoleucon laurels, but man, are they great. Lustrous green foliage plants that happen to flower, and just, you know, they do the job that you ask of them. And this one's probably been here for decades and decades. This is a super interesting space, really nice little seating area that right now it looks wide open because it's in the middle of January, but these are really giant fig trees out here that once they leaf out, you know, they come into leaf, it creates kind of a little private space out here in this circular area. One thing that's interesting is anytime we're here later in the year, this is where the students learn air layering. There'll be little bags hanging off of the branches on these fig trees later in the season, because they come out here and wrap some peat moss in a plastic bag around these branches to create new fig trees, to root fig trees out into in little plastic bags, and then you can cut the tree free from it. This is the spot where they teach it, is on these figs. And these have been size controlled over time. You know, figs can get, I mean, these are being controlled about 12, 15 feet tall, but I can see where they've cut them to the ground in the past. They just literally just cut them right to the ground and they come back from this. Because if you didn't, you know, I've seen fig trees as tall as trees, you know, 25 feet tall and 25 feet wide. But they look fantastic, and it's just a really interesting border, you know, space. In the wintertime, not so much, but in the summer, it's really quite beautiful. We're gonna end the video similar to the way we started, with big, beautiful junipers that are contorted, beautiful, have a mind of their own. They almost bonsai themselves. Again, you never have more than, you know, if you put 3 side by side, they're not gonna ever look the same, but they're all gonna be super, super interesting. This was not long-term planning. These were planted in little, maybe 25-gallon size concrete planters here in a brick courtyard area, and then have just been allowed to grow to the point where now they're cracking, they're breaking apart the concrete planters down below. They could just remove them at this point. These plants would be much happier, I think, if they did, but it's just kind of funny. They were planted in these little tiny planters, and then I don't know how many years ago, and nobody's really paid any attention since, and probably time to remove the pots. Thank you guys for following along with this video. Let me know down below if you're interested in more of these kind of walk around the neighborhood and gardens, various gardens, and show off some interesting plants that we see. Thanks for watching.